I want to zero in earlier. At the beginning, you referenced corrupt leaders. Why corrupt leaders?
Because he used the word tyrant, and I find that tyrants probably have a level of corruption to them, a level of, I don't think you would be a tyrant if there wasn't a level of like not being super honest and super, yeah.
What is a tyrant? We talk a lot about it actually in my rhetoric class, but I just want to make, I'll get to it. I want to make sure that we understand what this means here. No one knows what a tyrant is. You want to make it on YouTube? Yeah.
Someone who leads with kind of like an iron fist.
Yeah. Kind of like someone who leads with an iron fist. I'll leave it at that. Essentially, you have like one person who steps forward. We can think of like a dictator, someone who steps in with an iron fist. It has a very negative connotation to it. But as you were talking, I was wondering if it has to have that kind of a negative connotation, because a tyrant is a person who comes in and says, here's how it's going to be. Why? Well, because this is what I've decided. Versus what he's talking about here, which is a person who comes along and says, well, here's how it's going to be. Why? Well, because it's in your best interest. Bless you. It's in your best interest. Don't you understand? Well, what if I don't want that? Well, that's how it's going to be, though, because it's with your best interests in mind. Democracy almost smiles at you, while the tyrant, crushes you with the iron fist. Yeah.
A tyrant is used like negativity because I looked it up on Oxford Languages. It's an oppressive and cruel leader. So, and the quote also uses alibi, and alibi is an excuse or defense for an alleged act, usually like a crime. So why would he use those words if it's not meant to be negative?
Yeah, very good. Very good. This is what it is specifically. Because what do you need an alibi for? Excuse to prove yourself innocent, particularly what kind of a context do we think of alibis as? What? Crimes, yeah? There's a bar in North Park called the Alibi. That's a great name for it. I guess if you ever, and then there's another one called The Office. And if you understand why would they call it The Office? Yeah, where were you all night? I was at the office. Why would they call the bar the Alibi? Don't worry, man. We got you. You were here all night. Don't worry about it. Yeah.
It depends on if you're thinking about the quote individually or politically. When we're talking about it politically, then it's about the tyrant. It's about like the leader who's trying to be like, hey, I'm doing what's best for you. And people are like, oh, okay, that's so nice. And then they vote for them. We're talking about Trump? Okay. Anyway, so it depends if we're speaking individually because, for example, a toxic relationship, if the guy is telling you, cut off your friends, they're toxic, it's in your best interest, and then you end up isolated because he's toxic, then it's more of a it depends if we're talking about politically or individually.
Well, yeah, but if your boyfriend tells you to cut off your friends, it probably is in your best interest, right? Because he knows better.
No.
Oh, now everyone's head turns up. Looks at me. What did you just say? But why is he doing it? This is an interesting point. Why do you suppose someone does that? Says, oh, get rid of all of your friends. Do you think it's conscious or do you think it's unconscious?
It depends. It could be subconscious or it could be conscious.
Yeah, it really will depend on the person. Some people will know quite well. Let's see if we can isolate you. So the difference between, let's say, like someone who's I guess the toxic person in a relationship and a cult leader. What's the difference? It might very well just be the level of awareness that a person has. In other words, if you're aware that by cutting people off you can control them, well, now you have, since you can do that, now you can do it systematically, and maybe now you can start a cult or lead a cult. If you're kind of doing it unconsciously, subconsciously, then it's just like you're being manipulative. It works, but you don't really understand why it works, or you don't even understand specifically what you're doing, if that makes sense. And so that might be part of what it is for a tyrant to become a tyrant, because the tyrant becomes aware of what it is that they're doing. It goes back to what you're saying specifically. Yeah, it has a very negative connotation because it kind of presumes oppressive means. Now, we call one person a tyrant, and then we have again very negative connotations with that. What do we call an oppressive group? politically. That's interesting, man. Because if we look historically, who's been the greater enemies? Has it been oppressive individuals or has it been oppressive groups? Yeah, I don't know. I'll leave that to you to consider. Socrates said that he believed that there were 5 forms of government. He calls them the 5 regimes. And he believed that the best of all possible regimes was what he called the aristocracy. And the aristocracy isn't what we think of it as. It's like kings and queens and things like that. The aristocracy is when a society is ruled by people who deserve it, by merit. He calls it the meritorious. In other words, it's a long story, but he believes that it's a group of people who've been trained since birth, raised up, and then installed because they know proper government, they know virtue, they know how to properly do all this stuff. However, he believes that such a society has never existed, but he said that would be the ideal form of it. But since you can't have that, he thinks that the next best form of government is something called democracy. And democracy is when you're ruled over, maybe not by the most meritorious, but by the most honorable. So we install people and we vote for them, maybe vote for them, but in any event, they come into power based off of the fact that they're honorable. They do the right thing virtuously. They might make mistakes, but and so he believed that Sparta was this type of a system. And then after that, you've got an oligarchy. So he believes that maybe you start off as a democracy, but over time you kind of devolve into an aristocracy. I'm sorry, into an oligarchy. And an oligarchy would be kind of almost like what we're talking about here, which is you're ruled by a few people, by just a few people. And you're no longer interested in honor and virtue. Now that's replaced by money. So the people who we put into power, or the people who rise into power anyway, are the people who have the most money. And that's a cultural symptom. Like for example, in our country here, we complain a lot about how you have to have a whole bunch of money to run for government. I mean, think about it. What's the cost to win a senatorial seat? It's like in the tens of millions of dollars that you have to raise in order to win. And we look at that and we're like, the system's corrupt. Man, this is terrible. Well, why is it that? Why is that the case? Don't you think that that's a reflection of who we are? We sit here all day and we just like worship money. And we're pursuing money, and we're constantly going, money, 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 money. I'm going to get that money. And then we have a politician who comes into power and is like, oh, I got that money. And we're like, you're corrupt. How do you think they got there? Because they're a symptom of the thing that we're worshiping. All societies are led by the people that are represent. I mean, we have a representational government, but we have a really representational government also. In other words, they represent us in Washington, but they also represent the values of our country. What are our values? Again, we worship money. We like to not have to be involved in stuff, and so we no longer pay attention. We love distractions. We love entertainment. I mean, our highest form of God is money, and right underneath that is entertainment. If we had to choose between money and entertainment, we'd probably tear ourselves apart. Fortunately, we live in a country where we have, fortunately in quotation marks, we live in a country where we have gobs and gobs of both. Where even if we're poor and bored, we still have more money and entertainment than anywhere else in the world at our fingertips. And so we're surprised then that we're worshiping money, that we're distracted constantly by entertainment, and then people come into power who are entirely corrupt. Well, why? Well, what would happen if any of us went into power? What do you suppose you would be like if you were a senator? Let me guess. We'd be different. We would make a real change, because we could never be corrupted by those things. Well then, if you couldn't be corrupted by those things, you would never get there in the first place, because you're not properly representing the people who you're getting votes from. So he believed that that form of government was oligarchy, where it's a very small group of people. And then oligarchy eventually, he believed, evolved into democracy. And for Socrates, democracy was the rule of many. Essentially, it was the tyranny of the many. You get all the people together and you go, what do you want? And what are the people going to want? Well, any of you guys wake up in the morning and say, I thirst today for responsibility. And you guys wake up in the morning and you're like, today is a good day to seek virtue and to do the right thing. Most people don't do that. Most people set out to be self-serving, and it becomes this really ugly circle where if you live in a culture that promotes that, then those base desires, well, then you feed into it, and you become more like that. And then everybody around us become more like that, and then it becomes a circle. And then if you do actually want to live virtuously, first off, if you live virtuously, people will think you're an idiot. I don't know if any of you have ever, maybe someone drops a wallet, or an experience like this, where maybe you see someone drop a wallet, you pick it up and you go, "Oh, sir, you dropped your wallet." And people will look at you and go, "Oh my God, you're an idiot. Did you take the money out first?" "No." "God, you're stupid." "So I'm virtuous, that means I'm stupid?" "Yes." Because you have to go after, you have to get your own, man. You have to, don't worry about, my goodness. We worship that kind of stuff. We admire it. Unless it happens to us, but by and large that happens. And then we're surprised when our culture starts to feed off of that. So now what happens if you take people, oh, and by the way, in democracy, not to be an asshole, but I've got 2 bachelor's degrees, 2 master's degrees, and a PhD. I spend a lot of time every day reading news, keeping up on what's going on in the world, being informed. And then my cousin who dropped out of school in 7th grade, both of us get to vote, and both of our votes count the same. And we're supposed to pretend like that's a good thing. Well, that way the people get to decide. Well, what happens when the people decide? If most people are greedy, self-centered, refuse to improve themselves, unvirtuous. So now all of us who are that way get to vote. Well, what do you suppose we vote for? And then we're surprised when our politicians are corrupt. The politicians aren't corrupt. They're being put there to do exactly what reflects us. And this is the problem that Socrates has with democracy. So now what happens when you let all of us run the system? It doesn't take us long, man. We screw it up. We get what we have right now. We've screwed everything up. So then we're sitting going like, oh no. And what have we all been trained to do since childhood in school? When something goes wrong, what are we supposed to do? Go find the adult in the room. This happened, and by the way, as teachers, you still see this stuff happening right now in our email chains. When someone gets upset about something, there's always that one teacher who will say, we should go to the administration, the district office to check out what the policies are regarding this. Don't you think you should talk to the person yourself? No, we should find out what the policies are. Go find the adult in the room. So we, through democracy, we screw everything up. And then we go find the adult in the room. And guess who the adult in the room is? The tyrant. So then the tyrant comes along and he's like, you guys have really, we're like, we know. You guys have really messed, we know, shut up. Okay, we'll shut up. Do this, this, and this. That's kind of oppressive. Look what you did. You think you did a great job? Just do what you're told. And then, just like democracy, the more that we become like that, the more we get represented by those negative things. Similarly, the more the tyrant is there, the more the tyrant feeds off of their own oppression and power, and it becomes very hard to dislodge a tyrant. Normally, it's the tyrant's lifetime that has to kind of pass before we can start to reset the systems. It becomes an ugly thing. But this is Socrates anyway. So the point is that when we're talking about the tyrant, he would say this is the worst form of government. And why does the tyrant do what they do? Well, for your best interests. It's to take care of you. Sometimes with a smile, sometimes with a sword, but whatever it takes. But that's always the alibi of the tyrant. It's the welfare of the people. It's for your own good. There's a guy on YouTube, his name is Get Smart Quick, and he sent me a message. We're talking about this thing here from yesterday's talk from other classes, and he sent me this question. He asked about what's called the bystander effect. Guess what the bystander effect is? What is this? Someone tell me. Yeah.
It's like, if you're, the example I always use is that if we're driving down like a non-busy road, like there's no one on the road and you see a car crash, or you see somebody on the side of the road who needs help, you're more likely to pull over and help them. But if it's a really busy road and there's a lot of cars and then you see someone on the side who needs help, you're more likely to pass them by.
Yeah, exactly. The bigger the crowd, the less likely you are to intervene. But that's a really, really important concept, because it doesn't apply just to like social psychology, where if someone trips and falls and they hit their head, if you're by yourself, you're far more likely anyway to go over and try to help them. But if there's a whole crowd of people, we all look at each other like, Or you're gonna do something, someone's going to do something, and we're all sitting around waiting for someone to do something. So anyway, he asked me this question about collectivism and populism and socialism. Collectivism being the idea that, well, it's just what it sounds like. It's when you prioritize the needs of the group over the needs of the individual. In the United States, we have the Constitution, and the Constitution is designed to affirm the rights of the individual, not the collective. It's the complete opposite of this. The idea is that unless you protect the rights of the individual, you can't protect the rights of a society as a whole. Then you look at a system like in China, they're the complete opposite. We have to take care of the whole, even if we have to sacrifice the individual. So two very different ways of approaching it. Two very different ways of seeing human life. And I'm trying to think, over in Ukraine, for example, y'all have heard obviously what's going on over there. Does anybody know what the body count is over there? How many? 900,000? I mean, how many Russian soldiers are dead? I read a number a few weeks ago, it was like 16,000. But I'm not sure, but that was a few weeks ago. Who knows where that number comes from? I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me. But imagine, think about that. In a few weeks of war in Ukraine, they've lost more soldiers than the United States did in Afghanistan and Iraq over the course of a decade. You know, and by far, I think we lost like 7,000 or something like that. And we sit there, we look at that, 7,000 in the course of 10 years, 20 years, and we go, that's way too many. Why? Because in our society, we value the individual over the collective. Russia looks at 16,000 casualties in 2 weeks, and they're like, this is acceptable. Because they're more of this. They value the group over the individual. No one person is special. I'll be very careful, by the way, of going this direction, because this is exactly the kind of thing that almost requires a tyrant to run it, to be in charge of it. And then if that's the case, well, of course, your rights mean nothing. You don't have rights, they're taken from you. And then there's populism, which is kind of like the idea that you've got the most of the population against the elites. So this, we talk about like the 1%, the top 1%, and then the rest of us. That would be kind of like a populist way of looking at it. And then you've got socialism, which is more political, that the society kind of owns the means of production collectively. So there isn't private property in the way that we think of it today. So you got these three things that are all kind of related together. And then you've got this bystander effect, which he was asking about. How do these things, whether the bystander effect kind of applies to that when we're talking about this. Like, for example, the way that a tyrant becomes a tyrant isn't typically that a person just overtakes the system. One person can't do that. The way that it happens is that one person is allowed to overtake the system. So, for example, how does Hitler come into power? Anybody know how does Hitler come into power? You should all know this. Yeah.
He started off as a soldier, and then he worked his way up by making connections and with the generals after that.
Yeah. And then when he had any official comes in, yeah.
Didn't he blackmail them? Like the people above him?
Yeah. Yeah. A little bit of blackmail, a little bit of making the connections with the right people. And then he had to have the support of one other group. Maybe it's a bad way of asking the question. Is there a glorious revolution? I mean, he tries one, a beer hall push, but that one, he goes to jail over that one. When he gets out of jail, how does he actually come into power as prime minister? Huh? He just ran. And then the people were like, yeah, okay, this Hitler guy, loved the mustache, let's vote for him. Yells a little too much for me, but, whatever. Why? Well, because he represents the people that have voted for him. He represents where the country is at the time. When you look at even like President Trump, how does Trump come into office? Because he represents the sentiment of what's going on in the country. It's what it is. How does Biden come into office? Exact same way. He represents the tone of the country at the time. As much as we like to say, oh, but people get hoodwinked, people get lied to, people get tricked and manipulated, of course everybody else does. Not us, but everybody else does, of course. Because we're smarter than everybody else, of course. But then, why? Well, because, again, that's a reflection of where we are as a country at the time. If it's true, then that just means that's because we're not paying attention. And then, again, that's a reflection of us. So these become a reflection of this. How is it that the tyrant comes into power? Because we're sitting there and the tyrant's, giving these speeches, and we're like, man, someone should do something. And then we all very heroically, with our hands on our hips, shake our heads, and then we go home and we do nothing. We keep waiting for somebody else, and then the connections get made, the blackmail happens, and all of a sudden the support structure's in place, and then when someone finally does say, I guess now it's time to do something, now it's too late, because now you're being blackmailed, now because those connections can overthrow you. And so all of these things kind of require this to happen. How is it that a person loses their individuality, their individualism, their sense of self? Because that's what's being lost here. There are advantages to this. It's like collectivism. I mean, it's like slavery. Say what you want, but slavery does get shit done, right? Cheap labor costs. You all should know that. Many of you have iPhones, so you should know the value of proper slavery, right? I know we don't like talking about that, but that is who's building those things for you. But then what's being lost there is the individual. That person no longer matters. That person who has their own thoughts, feelings, emotions, loved ones, life experiences, doesn't matter. What can we do collectively? And then you see corporations that get run this way, by the way, as well. It's not just in totalitarian regimes. Corporations get run this way as well. We can get rid of the individual if we can raise our profit margins, because that's the thing that's important to them. Same with populism, same with socialism. These things happen because we stand by. Tyrants come into power not because they walk around and they beat everybody up, but because they get to a point where by the time we finally decide to do something, it's too late. We're always waiting for somebody else to do it. So guys, I guess it kind of begs this question. Does that mean that therefore we should run around and beat back tyrants? I don't know, man. Netflix has some pretty cool shows on. It's a bit of a distraction, right? I still play Candy Crush. There's all kinds of, there's a lot of things to do in life. And that's the problem. The tyrant is hyper-focused on doing one thing. And they're zeroing in on that. Many of the rest of us, we've got too many other things in life to do. We can't spend all of our time beating back tyrants. We have to live a life. That's not what we're focused on. I can almost think of it like prisoners in prison. Why can prisoners in prison get away with so much of what they do? Because they have so much time. If you've got nothing but 20 years of time or nothing but 10 years of time, you can figure out all kinds of creative ways to break rules. And the guards have to be there, and they've only got 8 hours at a time on shift, only 4 hours at a time with the population. It's hard to keep up because they have all the time in the world. Tyrants have all the time in the world. And you're going to find, I think, they don't come into power just by being mean. They come into power by telling us it's for our own goods. So, questions, comments, concerns, complaints, criticisms, critiques?